Hi everyone, welcome to the Panhandle Research and Technology Tour Plus, hosted by the Panhandle Research and Extension Center in Scottsbluff, Nebraska. This event was recorded on December 3rd, 2020.
The next presentation up is Jeff Bradshaw, our entomologist here at the station, and he's going to talk about his dry bean wheat relay cropping systems. All right, take it off, Jeff.
Hello, my name is Jeff Bradshaw, and I am the Entomology Specialist at the Panhandle Research and Extension Center. I'm going to talk about a study that the PHREC Entomology Lab, in collaboration with the Dryland Cropping Systems and Weed Sciences labs, to evaluate a relay cropping system for the Panhandle. Relay cropping is a field management strategy where two crops are produced in the same field simultaneously. The most common practice is to seed a summer crop into an established winter crop. A relay crop has the potential to suppress weeds and conserve natural enemies in the established winter crop. In dry beans, the winter crop should facilitate a taller bean crop, thereby reducing yield loss to direct harvest. We would expect increased crop profit per acre with more grain per acre and fewer inputs. Lastly, we should see greater crop resiliency. For example, through wind protection of dry bean seedlings early in the season. On the right is an aerial view of our experiment this year. Across the bottom row, from left to right, you can see listed examples of our treatment plots: a wheat bean relay, wheat as a cover crop, dry bean only, and wheat only treatments. We used 20 40 by 40 foot plots for our 4 treatments in 2020. The bean variety was Panhandle Pride, and the wheat variety was Brawl CL. In 2019, we saw that the presence of wheat resulted in cereal aphids. This is not surprising. In fact, we are depending on these sub-economic populations of aphids to recruit natural enemies that should spill over into the dry bean crop, particularly in the relay treatment. Although not significant, and this is just a small sample of the data from 2019, we saw an increase in natural enemies, particularly in the relay treatment and wheat-only plots, likely as a result of recruiting cereal aphids into the wheat. We also saw a significant reduction of weed biomass, in this case lamb's quarters, in the wheat-only and wheat dry bean relay treatments. Let's talk about the 2020 methods. We sampled both beneficial and pest insects using a number of methods in 2020. Pitfalls allowed us to take samples at the soil line. Sticky traps, vacuum samples, sweep net samples, and flower sampling allowed us to sample different pests and beneficial insects in the canopy. Pheromone traps let us measure the occurrence of western bean cutworm moths around the study site. However, just sampling natural enemies doesn't measure their effective activity. So we used several methods for detecting biological control activity. We put out sentinel western bean cutworm egg masses, as indicated here. We used sentinel meal moth eggs on cards, also in the canopy. We also used sentinel waxworm larvae pinned into clay and placed on the ground to measure biological control activity at the soil level. And lastly, we also used sentinel artificial caterpillars constructed out of artist clay. On the image on the right, you can see an undamaged artificial caterpillar on the bottom and bite marks on the artificial caterpillar on the top. These are all published methods, so we're not experimenting with new methods in this study, just the cropping systems themselves. Looking into this growing season for 2020, the wheat and dry bean only plots were terminated on May 6th, followed by the cover crop plot termination on May 26th, and the alleys were mowed on May 29th. Our dry bean crop was planted on June 2nd. Here, the image on the right, you can see how the plots looked in the various treatments following the dry bean planting. We've got the relay treatment, the conventional dry bean treatment, and the cover crop treatments shown here. The beans emerged a week later on June 9th, and we saw no significant difference in bean emergence timing between the various treatments. Wheat in all of the plots was harvested on July 14th with no damage to the bean canopy by the harvest implement for wheat in the relay treatment, which is shown here. You can clearly see that we were able to harvest the wheat over the bean canopy without clipping that many beans. Dry bean stem elongation was at least twice that in other treatments most notably by July 16th. Imaged here, you can see the cover crop treatment, the conventional bean planting treatment, and the relay treatment. And as you look across, you can see that the relay beans were significantly taller and had a first internode length that was quite a bit longer than the remaining treatments. Let's look at more detail at the methods that we used and the results from those methods in our 2020 season, looking at abundance from our vacuum samples, some information on function, and crop yield and damage measurements. From these methods, I'll be presenting insect data from the 2 dates that we have been able to analyze thus far, those being July 4th and 13th, just prior to winter wheat harvest. Let's look at the 2020 results. To date, our data from the artificial caterpillars are inconclusive. The method is challenging as our high temps make the artificial caterpillars extremely fragile and challenging to extract meaningful information from. The Western bean cutworm egg masses analyzed to date show very little predation rates, but you can see on this figure here that some were measured to date. We have more to look at still. For the data analyzed thus far in 2020, we have not seen any significant treatment difference on aphid abundance on these 2 dates and no increase in predators. The figure on the left shows the mean number of aphids per plot, with wheat in gold, dry bean in blue, cover crop in red, and relay in green, indicating no significant effects of mean number of aphids per plot. The figure on the right shows the mean number of predators per plot with the same treatments, with no significant effects over these 2 dates. Looking at bean damage, you can see that the percent of damaged beans on the y-axis shown here is quite low. However, we still saw a significant reduction of damaged beans in the relay as compared to the dry bean only treatment. Here you can see on that figure, the dry beans had a damage of around 0.15% versus the relay treatment of 0.05% damage. Regarding some of the production aspect of the treatments, we saw a significant reduction of the wheat yield per plot, particularly in the relay treatment, which is a function of the wheat that was rogued out when seeding the dry bean crop. Here you can see our wheat yield in bushels per acre in the wheat only plot was around 25 bushels per acre, and we reduced that in our relay treatment to 15 bushels per acre. Again, we think that's due to roguing out the wheat through our dry bean planting process. So that was somewhat expected. However, we also saw a significant reduction in dry bean yield. Shown here on this figure in count weight per acre, we can see that the dry bean treatment and the cover crop treatment both yielded equally 20 count weight per acre, but we halved that yield down to 10 count weight per acre in the relay treatment. And we're still working to figure out the exact aspects that contributed to that reduction. If we compare our estimated returns, assuming average contract costs for both dry beans and wheat, we saw a much higher economic return in our conventional dry bean crop compared to the wheat bean relay. Our wheat production in this study did not produce enough to make up for the loss in bean yield, with about $318 per acre loss in the relay treatment. However, it is important to note that we hand harvested our dry bean crop in all treatments, so we might expect some greater yield recovery in our relay only treatment if we were to machine harvest all the treatments. In fact, in measuring pod height, in this case percent of pods above 2 inches, we can see that there were significantly fewer pods below 2 inches in the relay treatment. Therefore, the relay treatment would have had an improved yield recovery compared to the other treatments via machine harvesting method. That said, we've made a few modifications to our plan for the 2021 growing season that should allow us to improve on our planting design and maximize our yield potential. We thank the Nebraska Dry Bean Commission, dry bean growers, and the Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln for support of this work. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Has anybody got any questions on the relay system for Jeff? Come on. Okay, well, I've got a couple, Jeff. The thing about that I was intrigued with is that increase, or you got aphids into the system,
Right.
you know, with the wheat. Is that something that's common? I didn't think we had just really big populations of aphids.
Well, we don't have big populations of aphids. We have low populations, and basically you can't. It's challenging to grow any grass on the high plains without finding some aphids.
Okay.
And wheat in particular is a pretty good resource for about 4 or 5 different species of aphids. Our cereal grain aphids, for example, are usually always present. There hasn't been a year where I can't find at least one English grain aphid, or maybe one Russian wheat aphid, or a couple green bugs sometime during the season. So,
Okay.
so
Are these the ones that can also be vectors for various viruses? Are these
well, the
particular?
Russian wheat aphid certainly can be.
Okay.
Um,
I just don't see that as a problem generally, but where are they coming from? They just are attracted to it somehow.
well, some of them are migratory. Some do overwinter. But like I indicated, that kind of was our hope, that we would have a very low level of aphids that'd be recruited by having the wheat just present. And so then we'd have the recruitment of some of those. Normally what we'd have early in the season in a bean field is pretty much nothing. You'd have some residue, in several acres of, maybe border area around that's growing, but nothing actually in the field. So the attempt here was to establish something in the field before the beans come up that can recruit sort of that ecosystem of beneficial insect prior to the beans coming up.
Okay, it looks like Emily, is that you that wrote in here about hand harvesting? I can't tell, but anyway, it looks like there's a question, Jeff, here about why would hand harvesting result in lower yields compared to the machine harvesting?
Well, I may have said that backwards. So hand harvesting the beans would have resulted in optimal yield recovery from all the plots.
Yeah. Okay.
We would have anticipated that we might have you would have higher bean loss with any machine operation. There's always some bean loss, as we learned from John Thomas's presentation. So basically what I'm saying is we had the best case scenario for yield recovery because we pulled every bean out of the area that we.
Okay, well that makes sense, because yeah, I think that's a good catch. I'm also curious that you mentioned that the relay system resulted in longer longer stem elongation, but it also resulted in lower yields in the beans. Now, is that and you said you're not real sure about that, but when I was looking at this, I've looked at it a couple of times. It looked to me that when you had the pictures of all those different ones, the system, that one that had the elongated stems that would then be really effective for direct harvest, to me looked like the root system itself had not developed to the same degree as the other systems. Did you notice that?
Yeah, it may not have, but we didn't pull plants and look at root systems.
No, I know, but what I'm saying is that perhaps one of the reasons how you didn't get this, you got lower yields with that system, is that the root system was not as established and picking up nutrients and water and so on.
Possibly. We had some other challenges with the study. When we planted, we had to go in probably a bit earlier than we would have liked to, given the condition of the soil. So we had recently had some, I think there was a rain event. Anyway, the soil was pretty wet. And so we had to go in and kind of created some challenges when you're direct planting into a growing wheat crop.
Right.
And you're trying to make a decent bed. So basically we ended up with, this year anyway, with beds that were a lot more shallow in the relay treatment because of all the green plant materials pushing up, right, the row units. And so we ended up with pretty shallow planting depth in those, to the degree that we had to come back in and kind of patch those seeds back in, patch them in with soil. So I think, that would have been a contributing component to any root development, right? If you didn't have,
Yeah.
if you had later establishment or a poorer establishment from the beginning.
Okay. Let's see. I don't see any else other questions yet. You also mentioned that there was a little bit of damage in the beans.
Mhm.
From that, and is it? But even though is that because you did clip some of you didn't do a lot of problems with the on the beans with the harvesting of the wheat, but you mentioned that it still was there was some damage to the beans as a result of that trick.
Yeah, the damage report was Western bean cutworm damage. So we
Oh, right,
specifically
okay.
looked at the beans for
Right.
Western bean cutworm damage and saw that we did have lower Western bean cutworm damage in the relay treatment, even
Okay.
though overall damage was way low.
Right.
It happened to go in the direction that one might predict it to go if you had biological control consuming Western bean cutworm eggs, and thereby improving your late season
Sure. Okay.
cutworm damage.
I guess I was also intrigued with that artificial larvae that you had there. Did y'all make those, or can you just buy those as a product?
As Johan, who's on, knows really well, like 50% of entomology seems to be arts and crafts.
Okay. Yeah.
And so that modeling clay was pressed through a potato ricer. So that's how we formed our little artificial caterpillars.
Okay.
The reason they didn't work well is I think in other systems, they've been used in crops that have a much stronger, more dense canopy. Whereas the dry beans, at least, in July when we were testing them, they still don't have, you compare them to a soybean plant and the canopy, there's a lot more light getting through a dry bean canopy, for example,
Right.
particularly out here. So basically the little artificial caterpillars started to melt.
Okay.
But in other studies, they worked really well. But obviously they're just not going to work well for us.
Okay. And they're just modeling clay?
Yeah. Yeah.
But were the insects attracted by the color, or just by it just looked like a caterpillar?
Yeah. So, previous work just has focused on a lot of the minute pirate bugs and whatnot, just searching about and poking their beak and anything that kind of looks like a caterpillar in terms of possibly color and shape.
Right.
And we actually trialed both green and brown color forms of artificial caterpillars and didn't really see any differences there.
Okay.
But then again, we had some other environmental challenges with those caterpillars.
Okay. Well, unless I've got one more question, Jeff, and it's just.
Johan's got a question in the chat.
Okay, sure. Did the surrogate prey predation rates differ among treatments? Any data on the main soil swelling predators?
Yeah, well, we have quite a stack of samples in the lab, so we just don't know yet. We have some indication that on the 2 sample dates that we've looked at so far that we can't discern any treatment differences, but that may not be the case after we pull out some of the other samples. And I don't think we've even gotten to the soil samples yet. So be interested in seeing the results from that once we get around to them. So sometime in 2021, we'll get our way through those samples, but Rick and JC are going to be really busy this winter.
Okay. I guess I just got one, just sort of a statement that it's a grower walked up to you and said something about, hey, I've heard about this relay system that you've got. What would be your response? Why should somebody try to do something like that? What are the advantages, I guess?
Yeah, my response right now would be don't try it yet.
Okay.
But
theoretically, what should be it? It just saving soil moisture and protection of the dry beans to good extent, till they get established?
Well, I think as Nevin alluded to earlier, and he can feel free to chime in as well. I think a major component of having cereals in the system is weed control. So you talked earlier about plants that suppress weeds, and he mentions that cereals are really good at suppressing weeds. And so one aspect of this is you've got a living wheat plant growing in the field, where in this case we used a Clearfield variety. So, the active ingredient in Raptor herbicide, it's the same. It doesn't affect the Clearfield wheats. Obviously, it doesn't affect dry beans negatively either. And so we've got the opportunity anyway for, I guess that would be in post, for maybe a compatible weed control, chemical control option for that relay system. But in addition to that, the wheat is already providing some weed suppression in just being there. So the weed control aspect of it is important. And then the other aspect of it from an entomological standpoint is that, at least in theory, I guess we're trying to show if it holds true or not, it should be able to recruit beneficial insects that then provide some protection in July by the time the Western bean cutworms start laying eggs, such that my hope would be that it might even be a replacement for an insecticide application later in the season, should we recruit enough biological control that it's effective. But as we talked about in Mitch's presentation, biological control can be variably effective depending on how successful we are in setting up that environment.
Okay. Anybody else?
And I guess, Bob, at the end of the day, if you can get 2 grains in one season, you should make more money.
Well, I was wondering about that too. I mean, it'd be like, instead of having to, plant and fallow, you get 2 of them in the same spot, 2 potentially, with if you can keep from tearing up the beans with the harvesting, because that takes some skill, wouldn't it? Some additional. Does that take extra equipment to do that?
No, you just direct seed into the wheat. Are you talking about harvest or?
Yeah. Well, when you're harvesting the wheat or you're cutting the wheat.
Well, yeah, I mean, you need a combine that you can come in with to combine the wheat off. You might possibly would have different equipment depending on your harvest operation.
Okay, well, I don't have anything else, Jeff. That's an interesting concept to pursue. I like to hear it as it progresses, the results. So I guess
got some ideas for 2021, so we'll keep pursuing it.
Okay, right. Well, that'd be good.
All right, thanks, folks.